redid the screen capture code, so it actually does session 0 isolation, and you don't have to migrate to capture the screen anymore. So the cool thing about the screen capture code is it actually uses unpublished technique to hijack the desktop. Hijack the desktop session using what's called session 0 isolation bypass, which is what Stephen Fuhrer came up with to go through this. The cool thing about this is it means screenshots now work on all new versions of Windows now. So Windows 7 64-bit, Windows Vista, it all works great. You don't have to migrate. You can do it from any process that has rights to the administrator's desktop or the running user's desktop. So that was a huge win just to get that working right. It took us forever to figure that out. Local privilege escalation is now implemented. You can just type use priv and get system on an interpreter shell, and it'll try to get you system. And there's a whole lots of little fun things to do it. One thing that's new on new versions of Windows 7 and Windows Vista to some extent, the admin user no longer has debug privileges. So if you're the admin user, even if you authenticate via UAC, you don't have debug privileges, you can't migrate. So this uses all sorts of fun tricks to start a service in the background, connect the pipe to the service, hand a token back off to the admin user, get the admin user to get a debug privileges that way. So get system is the magic one-line command that now gets you system access to a target. And if you're vulnerable to Tavis Orbity's KI trap debug, it then uses that for privilege escalation as well. So all sorts of really cool things rolled into one nice command, and that's just the very beginning of our privilege escalation support. We plan on doing a whole lot more going forward. All the token manipulation stuff is different. Every thread and interpreter now has its own token. This is a little bit nitty-gritty, but I'll fly through a little bit. Anyways, lots of fun stuff. All the incognito features are being rolled into the main Metasploit, basically, if you're familiar with those. 64-bit support that we talked about, migrate back and forth from 32 to 64, back and forth. So wherever you need to be, you can be. We overhauled the VNC injection payload, which is a lot of fun. That basically lets you go straight to an interactive desktop of any target you compromise with Metasploit without installing any software right into the disk. This had the same challenge where you couldn't migrate to the session 0, the basically interactive desktop from a service on new versions of Windows because of the session 0 isolation. And we used the same trick that Stephen Fuhrer came up with for screenshots to bypass it on VNC. So another really neat way to go straight to a desktop, even when you theoretically shouldn't be allowed to. And it's a lot more responsive than it used to be. We upgraded the whole thing to tight VNC. Finally, we looked at kind of what people were using security tools for, and one of the biggest gaps we saw were in the brute force realm. I mean, there's tools like Medusa and Hydra, THC Crack, lots of things like that people use from day to day on the pen testing side. And there's some vuln scanners, and even Expose does some default password checks, but there's nothing really conclusive or comprehensive out there in terms of brute forcing multiple protocols, but then also using those authentication credentials to go do something else. Like Medusa will get you credentials, but it won't give you a shell. And I want a shell. So we went through and we overhauled the SMB brute forcer, MySQL, Postgres, MS SQL, IBM DB2, Telnet SH, Tomcat, and HTTP. So in every case where we can crack a password and get a password from one of the various sources that we pull it from, we'll automatically open up a session too. So you can use a default Tomcat username and password, and we pulled in all the weird vendor defaults as well, to immediately upload an interpreter shell or a Linux remote shell on a vulnerable target. So really nice way. That included creating a support for WAR archive files, all supports JBoss, lots of fun things there. So a lot more support for compromising databases, a lot more support for compromising application servers. And one of the neat things about the generic HTTP one is this finds you just tons and tons of vulnerable devices. All those crappy little printers and switches you find in the network during normal assessment, this one will just basically brute force them to find out the default password. And something a little bit different about how we built the brute force support and the default passwords is we didn't just go and grab the default password list from Pheno Elite or one of the other websites out there. We actually spent 2 days over the weekend doing searches for file type, PDF, in URL, product manual, and going through every product manual of every product we could find with the word SSH or Telnet in it, pulling the defaults out of the PDFs, adding it to our files. So the defaults in Metasploit 3.4 are actually much more accurate than even the existing password lists that are available. One of the cool things we added was the ability to automate command shells. So before, if you want to do fancy scripting, you can only do it on an interpreter shell, but that doesn't really buy you much when you're on a Linux shell. So we now have the ability to do full-blown automation on Linux shells, Unix shells, Cisco device shells, 3COM shells, whatever have you. If it's a stream socket, you can talk to it, you can automate it without having to write a plugin for it. One of the cool things that Josh worked on is able to upgrade any Windows command shell session you have into a real interpreter shell using all kinds of crazy command line foo, and it all works pretty nice now. So you can do session-u and ID number of a command shell, and it becomes an interpreter shell. So, and since then, of course, 60 new exploits and over 40 auxiliary modules. This is actually at 62 or 63 now, depending on what time you update and how busy Josh is at the given point. So a little bit about security and pen testing in general. There's a lot of things that just aren't really that great with the state of security these days, and this is kind of where we went, what we started to look at when we started doing the design specification for Metasploit Express. And everyone likes to text message me while I talk. Let's see. So if you look at it overall, it's positive, but it's pretty slow progress. There's a huge group of researchers out there. They all do really cool stuff. There's lots of cool techniques and tools being used. Lots of compliance bodies are saying you must have security, you must do these things, all your different regulatory bodies out there. It's slowly improving the communication between researchers and vendors and corporations. The relationships are still getting better, or in cases where they're just unsolvable, they're just getting avoided and worked around, either through companies like programs like ZDI or iDefense, where they just buy the vulnerabilities and treat it and handle it that way. Either way, security in general it's moving forward, but it's not really going leaps and bounds forward. Not like it was 4 or 5 years ago when things just changed much quicker than they do today. The downside is almost all the innovation in the security field right now is being locked into commercial products. If there's a new exploit technique, if there's a new evasion technique, if there's a new testing method, if there's a new web application system, very rarely do you see tools being published these days that do whatever that new thing is. It all gets rolled into whatever the researcher's company's product is and used as kind of a selling point, like I'm doing now. It's a selling point. The difference is all the stuff that we're working on goes straight to the open source tree, and it goes in the open source tree first. So anything cool we work on, any of the fun payload stuff, any of the automation stuff, it's still going straight to the open source tree, and we're not trying to screw the community in any sense in terms of how we do development or how we innovate going forward. So there's a lot of challenges out there. I mean, very few companies still proactively test their security. We're talking to a gentleman in town, asking him if he wants to be a beta tester for Metasploit Express, just a friend of mine, and he's saying, well, we like to do security stuff since we are IT security, but we're not allowed to because we're too busy fixing desktops from viruses. And it's like, so you're spending your time fixing desktops from malware installations that you could be doing something about to prevent in the first place. Yeah, but if we don't work on that, then we look like we're not doing our job. It's like, well, what if you're doing vulnerability scanning, vulnerability testing, and exploits, and this and that? Well, they see that it's a waste of time. So there's still companies out there, and this isn't a small company. This is probably a Fortune 1000 that just don't take proactive security testing seriously. They see security as a cost center, as a maintenance hassle, but they don't do much to proactively, reduce those costs by doing scanning, pen testing, things like that. There's very limited adoption based on the existing solutions because what's out there right now is pretty complicated. If you hand your general, run-of-the-mill admin a copy of Metasploit and say, here, go, they're going to look at you like you're freaking crazy and be like, go what? They're probably going to tell you to go do something else. But yeah, what's this weird, crazy black and white console? I have no idea what to type in this thing. I mean, is this DOS? It doesn't seem like DOS. So you can have a lot of problems with just folks, unless the tool is really intuitive to use, you're not going to get a lot of adoption. You're not going to really see big changes in how people do their testing. And there are great, nice, GUI, clickable tools out there, but a lot of them are way outside the budget of these organizations. And if your choice is, I can either hire a new body for this price, or I can buy a tool for it, you're probably going to hire a body because they can at least respond when you yell at them, as opposed to sit there and tick and spin little spinners. So it's more satisfying to be able to yell at a body on a program for the same price point. So a lot of solutions out there are pretty complicated, and none of these solutions really talk together or work well together. You can take data. There are some exceptions, like a lot of the Archer products, a lot of the other SIEM style products really do lots of correlation and integration, but they don't really do it with the cooperation of the vendors a lot of times. They just say, okay, we're going to figure out your data format and import it. Security tools are probably the worst out there because everyone's fighting over the same small niche of the industry space that no one wants to integrate with anybody else because it's, if you integrate someone else's product, you get all the benefit, they don't. So that's the fun thing when you look at kind of integrations happening these days. It's almost aggressive integrations happening in some cases. We look at it as kind of we want to integrate with everyone we possibly can because we not only want to be a consumer of data, we want to be a producer of data. And one of the major overhauls that happened in version 3.4.0 of Metasploit that's coming out and the Metasploit Express product we're going to talk about is the entire database schema was revamped. So everything you do once you've enabled database support, it tracks your history, it tracks your commands, it tracks your logins, it tracks every host you test, every data that it captures from any system you touch. All that goes into a database and you can easily export that. So we're really looking at interoperability as one of the big benefits of using the Metasploit and Expo's products. Both those products do import and export. And you look at generally how much pen tests cost organizations. If you actually hire a commercial consulting team to come in and do a pen testing, it can be really expensive if you're a small company. If you're looking at, do I pay the mortgage or do I hire a pen test company, no matter what the regulatory body says you have to do, you're probably going to pay your mortgage. You're probably going to do what you need to do to keep your business running. Security is always going to become second to survivability. So you look at the current pen test stuff, and you can either hire someone for crazy amounts of money, you can buy expensive tools for crazy amounts of money, you can use cheap and free tools for low amounts of money, but a huge time commitment and maybe a skill set that you may or may not have on staff. And there's not really much in the middle today, which brings us to Metasploit Express. So we're really trying to make security and penetration testing and some of the penetration testing techniques themselves mainstream. We're trying to take the things that your day-to-day pen testers have been doing for 10 years, put it into a tool, add a button, and say go. I mean, this isn't hard stuff. Like pass the hash. How many tools out there, commercial security testing tools, have a